Dr. David Gilley is from William Patterson University. He brought a student along today. See there, Trevor. Anyway, Trevor is checking it out. He's not a beekeeper, but we're hoping to make him one. And I want to thank David, who's spoken for our association in the past. He'll also be speaking at Eastern Apiculture Society in July, and he's here to give us a topic, and I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. You need to. Am I good?
He have lavalier microphones, so he could walk around. Sorry, Judy, we should have that.
Testing. Am I coming on over the microphones?
We'll get it turned on.
Testing. Everybody hear me? Yes. Very nice. Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity to be here to talk to you. It's been a few years since I've been here. I did come and address the state meeting one time before a few years ago. In case you don't know me, I'm a professor in the biology department at William Patterson University in Wayne. Let me go ahead and let's see. There's my title slide. So I've been here for about 10 years. I do have a background in honeybee research. I did my PhD at Cornell with Tom Seeley looking at queen-queen conflict during swarming. So my background is in swarm biology. I then went to Tucson, Arizona, USDA lab, and was looking at swarm biology of Africanized bees, which was very interesting. Before I came back up to New Jersey to William Patterson. So we're mostly an undergraduate-focused institution. We do have a small master's program in biology. I've been doing honeybee research, but kind of quietly and involving students. And just recently, where the origin of this project, which I want to introduce as a collaboration between myself and my students, as Kevin mentioned, Trevor at William Patterson, and you. This is using data from the New Jersey Swarm Report that has been reported by, I think, you, and looking to see what we can get from it. So it fits. This came about a year ago, talking with Charlie Ilsley, conversations that we had about swarming and how to manage swarming, and that just fit with my interest and background in the biology of swarming. So it's been a really nice collaboration, and as Kevin mentioned, I'll be presenting this summer at EAS, so it'll be interesting to hear your suggestions and comments sort of in preparation for that. In some ways, I feel like I'm representing you there. So let's see. Title here, Data-Driven Approaches to Predicting Swarm Flight in New Jersey. Here's the abstract. Everybody could read that, okay? That's just up there for archival purposes, mostly for me. Just to make sure that we're on the same page here, swarming is one part of a colony reproductive event in honeybees. Let me see if I can get these buttons right. So it's the part where the bees actually, we call this whole process the reproductive fission event. So it begins with many different preparations, rearing queens, the worker population increases, they start hoarding nectar, and lots of changes going on in the physiology of that mother queen preparing for departure. All of that stuff leads up to the part that, as beekeepers, we want to prevent, right? That's where we lose our bees. They depart from the nest and cluster. They find a new home in a process that's apparently interesting enough to write a book about. So the scouting and decision-making part of this, and then they found their colony. Meanwhile, back in the mother colony, this is interesting enough to do a PhD thesis on. So the parent colony, there's the queen fighting, and that was what I was working on there. And then sometimes secondary swarming, and then finally the mating and reconstitution of that colony. So anyway, focusing on the swarming here, so typical swarm management practices, in other words, swarm control, focuses, since this is what we want to prevent, it focuses on messing around in some way with these factors here. So you split the colony, you add extra storage space, checkerboarding, isolation of queen, restricting the queen. In some ways, all of those management practices play around with these cues that eventually, if left unchecked, will lead to the swarming process. But in addition to, so that's what I would call the intervention technique, all those different ways of trying to prevent the actual swarm departure, or swarm flight, I think, as I've called it some in this presentation. So this is what I would call the intervention technique. But in addition to that particular intervention technique, you've got to get the timing of that technique correct. And that requires at least two, what I think of as separate things. One is, what you've got to do is you've got to know when swarms typically depart and use that as a way of back calculating then from when swarms typically depart and figuring out when you need to go in there and perform your intervention technique to prevent the swarm before it ever gets started. So for example, I don't know if you can see this here. Sorry. But if you've got, this is from a paper that David Tarpey and I wrote several years ago. If you've got a primary swarm that's departing, let's say in early June, June 5th or so, this is data from Ithaca in upstate New York, so it's a little bit later than here in New Jersey. But what you want to do is you want to back calculate from that time into past the queen rearing period, somewhere into the pre-fission, what I'm calling here in this scientific paper, the pre-fission period, in order to prevent that queen rearing before it ever starts, and a lot of the other cues. So that queen rearing takes about 16 days, so we're talking about at least projecting 16 days from that swarm timing into the pre-fission period. So you need a good estimate of when swarms fly, and I kind of want to present this as there are lots of issues with swarm management and effectively preventing swarms, but I want to kind of present this as perhaps the most challenging one because it's variable. In some ways, the intervention technique and even the duration of the back calculation are prescriptive. In other words, once you figure out what the most effective intervention technique is and what the appropriate back calculation is for that particular intervention technique, it's prescriptive. You can say, do it like this, A, B, C, D, and it should work. One of the things that makes swarm prevention really tricky is that the timing of the swarm, as is illustrated by this figure, varies hugely over the course of each year and by region. And that makes it very difficult to nail that timing just right. So this is what we want to figure out, how can we really get that timing just right. This brings up the issue of phenology. This is the science of essentially linking natural cycles of blooming with the events that are happening over the course of a season and dealing with this issue of seasonal and regional variability in cyclical seasonal processes. So beekeepers aren't the first ones to ask this question of, can we predict natural seasonal events based on what's happening during the season? So that's what this science of phenology is all about. This is based on this idea of grow degree days, and perhaps you've heard of these before, but this is essentially, I've got the formula down here. Basically the idea is grow degree days are a cumulative measure of accumulated thermal energy over the course of a season. And the way that you calculate them are, you take the average temperature during a day, in other words, the maximum temperature during a given day for a 24-hour period, plus the minimum temperature, usually overnight, and then you average those to get the average temperature over that day. And then you subtract from that some base temperature, and the convention for this is 50 degrees. That's pretty universally used as far as I understand for understanding phenology and building up phenology calendars. So what you get, and here's an example, if you want to go back and look at this later and want to have an example of that. So what happens is, so we usually think of this, so each day that's where the average temperature is over 50 degrees, you accumulate some grow degree days. And so what happens is over the course of a season, you get this increasing trend, this accumulation of grow degree days. And what you can do is then pin certain biological events, like the bloom of a certain species, to a certain grow degree day. And this is essentially, the biology that's behind this, is that the development of a lot of organisms in nature is dependent upon chemical reactions. So these are chemical reactions that are catalyzed by an enzyme, and so the speed at which the development occurs is directly dependent on that accumulated thermal energy. So you can do things like we have here for the Ohio State has a leading role in this. They've developed this really nice online phenology calendar where you can type in your zip code if you live somewhere in the area. You can try this for your own zip code, but I don't think it's in their database. So you type in your zip code, and then it gives you this calendar of events that's happening based on, and I know you can't see this here, but up in the corner of each one of these is a grow degree day number. So, for example, this is saying the eastern redbud has their first bloom on, I can't even read this, on grow degree day 191. Now, interestingly, it's not only plants, it's also insects. So this is also saying gypsy moths. Gypsy moths on grow degree day 192, you expect gypsy moth eggs to hatch. And this is very predictable. Once you figure out this relationship, you can use it to predict. So you get to grow degree day 185, and you go, I better get out there and treat for the gypsy moth eggs, or have whatever the appropriate. If there's an intervention technique to prevent, some kind of pest or anything like that, or to apply fertilizer for plants, that kind of thing. And here are just a couple examples of that. So. Again, you can see the grow degree days are accumulating here, and this is very tightly linked to the developmental stage, in this case of wheat. And then down here for another insect here, a locust or grasshopper of some sort, they've got a nice straightforward relationship. As temperature increases, the development rate increases in a linear fashion. So you can use these things pretty well for plants and for these sort of solitary pest species. The question here is, can we use this to predict the events that we're interested in for bees? Does it work for bee colonies? And this is a question that doesn't have an obvious answer, I think, because on the one hand, hey, why not? I mean, bees are tuned to the flowers and to the seasons, and their reproduction should be dependent on what's happening outside. I don't think anybody would argue with that. But on the other hand, bees are a little different from these organisms in that they're essentially, a colony anyway, is essentially a homeothermic organism. Their developmental state doesn't, in a one-to-one direct way, depend on the temperature, because they're creating their own temperature. So it's an interesting question. So data, what does the data say? Can we get data that can show whether grow degree day is a good way to predict swarm flight? Well, luckily we have this New Jersey swarm report. It's great, and this is where we were so happy to say, oh, we've got such good data. We've got data from the last 3 years of almost 400 swarms that you all and your colleagues have reported. So what we've done here is we've used this data to do an analysis to see whether grow degree day is a good predictor of swarm flight. This is a summary of the data, so we're talking about 2013, 14, and 15. And this is just kind of a breakdown so you can see, I'm going to talk about the regions in just a second, but you can see at least the yearly totals, 126 from 2013, 166 from 2014, and 80 from 2015. And I put some conditions on this, like really we're talking about spring swarming, so anything that happened really late in the season, we excluded from the data set. But still, we ended up with 372. And again, I'd like to thank Kevin and Charlie for providing this data set and curating it and helping with the analysis. So the first thing we did is we wanted to look at region as an issue. We know that swarm dates vary. We expect that swarm dates are going to vary by region, and this is one thing that we want to hopefully, if this idea, ideally there would be a universal grow degree day, just like with that calendar, where we say, okay, on grow degree day 250, bees swarm. and period. And so you can just calculate that for whatever your region is, and then you know when they were going to swarm. So the first thing we had to do was to link each of those 372 swarms to some kind of meaningful climactic location. And our approach for this was to use Rutgers, and the Office of the New Jersey State Climatologist has these climate zones, 5 climate zones in New Jersey that capture the major climatic variation within our state, of which there is quite a bit, right? The north is very different from the south, for example, coastal versus inland. New Jersey is a heterogeneous environment. We didn't use the counties. I just wanted to note, at least for this analysis that I'm going to show at first, because these are essentially political boundaries and the bees don't care about them, right? We want to use what is affecting the biology of the bees as a regional variable. So what we did is the climatologists, they maintain about 50 weather stations distributed over the state. And so what we were able to do is we had the zip codes of each of the swarms provided by you all, and we were able to look at what is the nearest New Jersey weather station to each swarm. And then we said, okay, and then in what region is that weather station? So we were able to get a region for each swarm. We then calculated, we used the Cornell University, runs the Northeast Regional Climate Center, and they have this really nice tool where you can go on and type in your dates and which you specify which weather station you want to use, and it will give you, and this goes back, I don't know how far the data goes back, far. So you can do this pretty far back. And you can use it to calculate, to convert a calendar day into a grow degree day, to transform it. So this is what we did through a lot of labor. I'm not going to claim any credit for this because I didn't do this part of it, but it was a lot of work. For each swarm, you have to go in and type it in and get and convert it into a grow degree day. This was Charlie and my student Trevor Courtwright, who both actually with the same data set calculate these grow degree days. So for each swarm, we have a region and we have a grow degree day. We also have, of course, the year, which is our other major variable here. We want to know whether the swarm date varies by year. And so in case you probably can't see this, but again, maybe in the video later or something, this is what our data looks like, just so you know what information we have and what information we haven't. We don't have. Okay, so then here are our questions that we're asking here with this data set. First of all, just in terms of calendar day, we know the calendar day of each swarm. What we expect to see is, so first we want to ask this question, is calendar day a good predictor of swarm flight? And then we're going to ask the question, once we transform those swarm flight dates into a grow degree day, does that help improve our predictive power? So what we're expecting here, first of all, just in terms of calendar date, is that there is going to be a difference. So I've just drawn some basic hypothetical graphs here of what we're expecting, so that if you look at different regions and plot the calendar day of swarming, we expect that it will differ by region in some way. For example, the north will be later than the south, right? Something like that. We also expect, for just pure calendar day, that the years will differ. We know that, we've had some crazy years. These last 3 years, it's actually an interesting data set, right? 2013, 14, and 15 were some interesting years. This year is going to be interesting too, I think. So we expect that the day that swarms fly will vary by year. Okay, is that everybody comfortable with that? Okay. Okay, I'm going to make sure that we get that first. So then, once we take these calendar days and transform them into grow degree days, effectively what we're doing there is we're controlling for regional, we're trying to control for regional and yearly differences. And so what we expect to see once we do that transformation is that when we plot those grow degree days for the swarms, we expect now that they will not differ by region or by year, right? And this is, again, that idea of as I say over here in tiny little letters, the strongest results here would be a sort of universal grow degree day. Again, no matter what region and no matter what year, honeybees swarm on grow degree day, 250 or whatever it is. All right, that would be the most, that's what our prediction is here. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. It's kind of counterintuitive because we're predicting the lack of a relationship, essentially, which feels weird scientifically at least, but that's what we're doing. So here's the data. This is the grow degree day data first. So if we ask this basic question first off, is there this universal grow degree day for swarming? The answer is what? I'm sorry, I'm used to a teaching environment, so I'll sit here and wait for the students to tell me whether the data supports the hypothesis or not. Does it? Maybe, right. Good answer, good safe answer. So it definitely changes, right? I mean, at least what pops out here? So we've got, and I'm sorry, maybe I should go through the axes here. So we've got the 5 different climate regions on the x-axis. I don't know if you guys can read those. This is central, coastal, northern, pine barrens, and southwest regions. And then on the y-axis is the median converted transformed swarm date, GDD date. And then the blue bars are 2013, the red bars are 2014, and the green bars are 2015. So what we can see here is that certainly I think one of the things that's obvious is that year is highly significant. The GDD date varies hugely by year. And let's see, I put this. So it was relatively early as far as grow degree days accumulated thermal energy in 2013, higher in 2014, and even higher in 2015. Even later, that means. And if you do the statistical validation of this with a general linear model, you find that year is highly significant and region is also significant, actually. So that's the other thing, that it's not quite as obvious, and I think I say in here marginally significant, a 0.04 p-value. Still significant, but not totally off the board. The trend that I think you can see regionally, if you agree, is that the northern seems to be later, higher, it's a higher GDD than at least the other 4 regions. Everybody good with that? Yeah. Okay, so I'll get back to that in a second. So far, at least this question here of is there a universal GDD, really the data doesn't seem to support that. But then there's sort of a more subtle question of, well, but is it any better than just trying to predict based on calendar date? So here's the data, here's the sort of untransformed data. This is just the calendar dates of swarming by region. Again, it's the same basic setup for the data here. We've got 2013, 14, and 15, and then the 5 different regions here. The statistics say that, again, region is highly significant, and that's pretty obvious here from the trend. And this is not unexpected, right? That in the northern region of New Jersey, swarms happen much later than they do in the other regions. And it looks like these two are not too far, probably not statistically different. Anyway, the statistics interestingly say that year actually is not significant. It's a 0.07 p-value. So you can see that there are differences by year, especially in certain areas, like I don't know what was going on in the central region here in 2013. So there are differences by year, but there isn't a consistent pattern of differences by year. I forgot to mention that I also plotted these gray bars in case anybody was wondering about those. Those are the means of the 3 years. Sorry, I forgot to say that, so I can flip back here. Oops. I knew I was going to do that at some point. So I can flip back here to, this is the GDD graph. So you can look at these mean values. Those are means of these 3 values. And then I also put some error bars on here. Again, I don't know if you can see these from where you are, but those indicate the uncertainty of that mean. So if you have a lot of variability, you've got large error bars. These are 95% confidence intervals. And if you have a little variability, you don't have a very good estimate. So, I mean, the gray bars are important because if you wanted to ask the question of, well, for my region, when should I expect swarms? The gray bars are essentially the answer to that question. So, for example, this is the calendar day data. So, for example, for the central region, the best estimate of the swarm day is calendar day 133 or so. But there's a huge variation associated with that because we only have 3 years of data. Now let me see. Oh yeah. So sorry, I'm getting sidetracked a little bit. Let me go back to that question of this question here of does the GDD. So we know there's no universal GDD, but does it help predict swarming? Is it better than just using calendar day? So my approach to this, I'm almost done here. My approach to this was to think about what we call effect sizes. What I've done is I've plotted these two graphs so that these intervals are about a week. Okay, well, exactly a week for calendar day here. So these interval, that's a 1 week interval, right? So the question is, so then I did the same thing for GDD, and so the question is the uncertainty here represented by these error bars greater for calendar day than for GDD? If the answer is yes, then GDD is to the degree that the answer is yes, then GDD is a helpful predictor of when swarming might occur, superior to just calendar date. Does that make any sense? Okay, so then let me flip back here. So here's the GDD data again. So I've made these intervals essentially 1 week. So I've assumed that you have about 15 grow degree days accumulating when swarming is at its peak. I think I looked at the data to get that. So that's about 105 grow degree days per week. So that's what that interval is. So the question is, are these error bars here, and I don't know if you can see these, but are these error bars here, are they bigger or smaller than, let me see if I can get the direction right, these error bars here? Whether you can see this or not, the answer is basically that actually the error bars are a tiny bit smaller. In other words, our estimate is a tiny bit better for the calendar day than for the GDD, which surprises me. It surprised me. Actually, I've had some time to stop being surprised by it by now, but I think it surprises Charlie too. Where's Charlie? Charlie was surprised by it too. Yeah, Charlie's surprised too. So I mean, what that suggests is that if we, by converting this to calendar day, to grow degree day, we haven't improved the accuracy of our estimate of swarm time at all, really. In fact, it's a tiny bit worse. I didn't promise, well, yeah, okay. I don't know, the data's the data, right? So here's my little summary of this is that same slide that I showed before with our expectations. So essentially we were wrong as far as whether calendar day is a good predictor of swarm flight. We were predicting that there would be differences. We were correct as far as year goes, at least the statistics support that relationship. They interestingly, they don't support the region difference. As far as GDD, we wrong. We did not get this lack of a relationship. We did see a significant relationship. So what are we to make of this? Let's see. So if I had to make some kind of recommendation here, so what do we do? Do we use GDDs as a basis for timing swarm interventions? I'm going to say, at least based on the data here, no. Maybe this will change, and this will be my first, if I haven't already said it, of advertisements. This whole talk is an advertisement to participate in the New Jersey Swarm Report, essentially. So the more, maybe as we accumulate data, this answer will change and we can keep an eye on this. But at least for these 3 years, the data suggests that it's not particularly helpful. Now, does this mean that the bees aren't tuned to the bloom? No, I don't think so. I mean, my interpretation of what's going on here is kind of what I was suggesting before about bees being essentially a bee colony being a homeothermic organism, that they're not directly dependent on accumulated thermal energy in the way other insects and plants are for their developmental cycle. There's more going on there. And from what I've seen in my past experience watching, for my PhD, I was setting up hives in colonies and observation hives, and just watching what was going on inside while the swarming events, while swarming proceeded. And it seems like there's a lot of false starts and stops. So they might get, and that probably happened really this year with the early spring, and then if they can start swarm preparations, but then if things turn ugly, they can stall and stall and stall. And so I think there's much more flexibility built into the biology of the system than there is for those for solitary insects, for example. Also, I think that to some degree, I mean, we're talking about predicting something that's unpredictable, the weather. And it makes sense for a bee colony in some ways maybe to peg its reproduction at a certain calendar day, because they don't know, they've got to get out there and start gathering honey and establishing their colony before winter sets in. That's the game for a honeybee colony reproducing. And so in some ways they're not just being dependent on what's happening now, they're predicting when winter is coming and trying to meet some target before winter comes. So I think in some ways it kind of makes sense. That's a post hoc analysis, though. I don't know whether I'm right. So another point on this: does this mean that knowledge of local conditions then doesn't matter? And I just want to say no. That's not what the data is suggesting at all, right? I mean, region was highly significant. So you still need to really know, and this is the non-surprising maybe conclusion, that everybody that has effectively, if you're effectively controlling your swarms, you already know this for your region. You've already got a system down where you know when the swarms are coming and you've got your intervention ready to go before that. So region is still really important. Where we're going with this now, I think, is that, so GDD doesn't seem to be a great predictor, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any good predictors. There may be some kind of bloom date of some, talking with Charlie about this now, dandelion bloom date or something that is a good predictor. And the nice thing is we've got this great data set from the last 3 years. We can keep using it. Hopefully it will get more and more complete, and we can keep using it and add in predictors and see if we can find something that is a good predictor of when swarming might occur. And in terms, I'm almost done here. In terms of usefulness, I said that we weren't using county. We didn't use county in the analysis I just presented, but I do have a table here broken down by county and this might repeat some of the summaries on the swarm report itself. In certain ways it overlaps. Anyway, so we've got the earliest swarm dates, the median swarm dates for each county, and then we've got this overall average 3-year swarm date. So you can take a look at those. That is the best information I have right now of saying, well, for my location, when should I expect swarms based on this New Jersey swarm report? Here it is. There are several counties where you see blanks, and I'll say that's because there's not if I had fewer than 5 reported swarms from a county, I said, yeah, we can't be calculating means or anything like that from that. So we need more data for those. And this is just a figure that summarizes that. I'll skip past this, but you can look at it later. To generalize the results and sort of advocate something here real quick, what we're doing here with the swarm report is essentially something that I've seen happen that we call citizen science. Other hobby groups and interest groups, clubs, have used this very effectively, and this is kind of what really excites me about this project. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology notably has this for birders. There's all this stuff where they've got an app on their phone and they see a bird and they can say, I saw this bird, and it tracks it right into this national database for bird conservation and all the things that they're interested in. And what I see here is kind of the beginnings of that kind of system, and it's really exciting to me. I mean, there's a lot of potential for this. So note that NASA also runs this honeybee net where they're using scale hives to look at issues of land use. And I forget, there are like 50 beekeepers or so across the country that have subscribed to this honeybee net and have their hives on a scale hive and are reporting to this centralized database, every day or whatever, their scale hives, and they're using this to look at issues of land use and climate change and such. And then of course we've got this, Kevin already showed this figure here, the New Jersey Swarm Report. So I think it's really exciting. I mean, we can look at maybe issues of bloom dates. This has potential, I think, for things like tracking mites. Maybe it has potential for if we had some kind of diagnostic of viruses. I don't know, maybe we could use this to track virus prevalence or something. Digital hive monitoring is also another thing that might be interesting to feed into this. There's a lot of potential there, I think. So I'll end this with my statement, again, my last advertisement saying, please participate in this New Jersey Swarm Report. We'll use the data that you provide. The more data there is, the better the predictions are. So, and that's true for within a given season, and also the more seasons that we do this, those error bars are going to shrink every season we do this, and the predictor, the estimate is going to get more and more accurate. So I'll stop there, and thank you. I can hear you.
Have you thought about tracking flight days? Yes. Because to me...
Tracking flight days was the question.
Yeah, because to me,
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen geese bringing in pollen on Christmas Day in February, and to me, that seems more germane than growth days.
Right. I mean, so this is that issue of like, so what is, if grow degree days are not a good predictor, what is a good predictor? And yeah, maybe it's the first bloom of a major honey plant. Maybe it's the first flight day. It's interesting. I mean, I expect that as you go back in time, there's a little more wiggle room. More things can happen. So you can have a really nice winter or something, but then things can change and go. So I don't know. It seems like theoretically, the farther you get back, the more wiggle room there is in your predictor. But yeah, I mean, we can explore this. If we can get that data on flight date, we can look at that.
You could have volunteers in
Yeah.
each of the regions
Right.
that
We could have volunteers.
are committed to reporting flight days.
Yes. We could have volunteers in regions reporting flight date. That would be great. And then we could test that. Charlie, you had something to say about that?
Yeah. Now this is sort of mind-blowing for the association. Okay. And the reason why is because this grow degree day is code. It's code for, in my case, first bloom day for an indicator plant. Now, I guess we got, I don't know how many old timers in this place. And what do they always say about managing their bees? When do you do it? When? Okay, so what's the question? When? Okay, well, it's when the dandelion blooms. Now, if you start charting your dandelion blooms, you find out, oh, it doesn't happen on the same calendar day each year. It's all different. It's all different. And I like one major point about your median grow degree day and calendar day thing. If you convert the grow degree day number on those graphs to the calendar day, what happens is, out it comes is almost the same calendar day as what is observed for the calendar. So there's an indicated control there. The indicated control is that blooms of plants are constant. The decision-making strategy of the beehive reflects the quality of the weather at that time and what forage is available. So it's not like the grow degree day thing is off the record. It's just got to be refined in application to because the plants and the bees are adapted together, I believe, as a matter of fact. But the grow-to-breed thing is not a good predictor of swarms. It has really not much to do with the back-time calculation of when you do the prevention. That's another question.
Right, and to follow up on that, I mean, the reason for that probably is that grow-to-degree days, certainly, it's still linked, it's just that it's very indirectly linked. You know, grow-to-degree days affect the plant bloom, and then the plant bloom affects all these other things that eventually end up affecting swarming, but there's so many links in between that our predictive value goes down. Do you have a question?
Related to what other people have said, in my mind, I think it's more a function of the amount of rain there is, the lack of rain, if you have very drought spring, you don't have the high rainfall. You have a lot of rain, it's going to wash out a lot of pollen. And you have just the right amount of rain, you have good pollen flow right, and good nectar flow right after the rain. So, you know, if I were to do a study like that, I might look more at the rain patterns and drought patterns and things like that.
Right. Yeah, these are all good. I guess what we should do, maybe I should have finished with this or somehow we can talk about, is make a list of all these other predictors that, you know, that might be things that are relevant. And you know, again, if we can measure these things, we can integrate them into this data set and look to see how good a predictor they are. We had a microphone.
Can you explain when the grow-to-breed days begin? Does it begin at 46 or 50 degrees, or does it begin at January with negative numbers, and then move on from there?
Right. So typically, at least in the analysis I've done, it begins. They reset every year, and then but through January, you know, in our region, you don't start accumulating any. You never have an average. So it'll start accumulating the day that the average temperature is above 50 degrees. So the first day where if we get 51 degrees as the average temperature, you'll start to accumulate one grow-to-degree day. So that doesn't typically happen, you know, until what? I don't know. When does that happen? March, yeah. Yeah, so like when we were looking at using the Cornell tool, you know, you'll see it just is flat at 0. You know, we're ready, if it happened, if a freak event occurred, it would go up a little bit and then it would stay steady at that for a long time. So you see it really slowly at first and then it goes zoop. Does that answer your question?
I'm looking at the chart here.
Yeah.
In the northern area, which is where I am, it concerns me that there's only like 3 days in between the swarm on the calendar. Is that correct? For the 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so if that's the case, there must be a fact that it's more precise, something like daylight, that is triggering these bees to react.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because they're not going by the weather conditions as much as they are going by something that's more exact. Because from year to year, you have much difference in weather. Okay, so I'm not going by the blooms and nothing, but you have 3 days in the north. The other areas, you have about a week, 7 days. I don't know how critical it is for those 16 days to actually predict it, because I'm not that good of a beekeeper. So you want to pinpoint that exactly to start drive prevention, but we're talking 3 days.
Yeah.
You're pretty sure by that every year.
Yeah, that's really surprising, isn't it?
You said yourself, it's not panning out. It's sort of being raised, although the acoustic is not holding true.
Yeah, that northern, I mean, this is a really tight, for whatever reason, in the north, we have very low variability. That is surprising. I mean,
3 days, so
yeah.
145 or 144, I can't say.
Yeah, this is 144.
145 or 146 day, you could say that's my swarm this year, so you don't even have to go figure nothing out, just go from that to that.
Yeah, I mean, what this data right here suggests is that at least for the north, we've got a really good predictor of when swarms are going to go within a couple of days. Now, yeah, now, I mean, who knows what'll happen this year, whether that'll change, but it's interesting that for some other regions, you know, it's much, I mean, look at Central here, I mean, who knows? But,
You have to equal to all the I've run this one before, so I see the stuff coming in.
Yeah.
One of the things I'll tell you is that the first year was kind of extra to everybody who knew about it. As the years go, we've been better communicating, so I think the data in the last year, there's survey fatigue. Let me ask this question. How many have seen this form so far as your resume? How many of you reported this form in one of the 27 we've seen so far? That's not too bad. I'm surprised by that. In the past, when I've asked that question amongst our group, a lot of people didn't. They'd seen this form, but they didn't report it, right? So it's important for us not to, I'm hoping, one of the reasons we really wanted to have you here is you can see that this could benefit year after year after year, we need better patterns out of this. So if there's any commercial for this, this is it. So hopefully you see a form. And I just want to reiterate, this is the rule. You don't have to catch this one, but you have to physically see it in your own eyes. I don't want someone to tell you about it, that it happened downtown, and you put it in. I would prefer that you physically see it. That way, we don't get 3 people who've seen the same storm and reported it more than one.
Good point.
I personally believe in growth of green aid because they predict vegetation, they predict feral insects that are not kept by man in hives. All hives are not created equal. Some people have styrofoam hives. This year, for the first time, I go buy bees in deep closets, which equalize the temperature. They keep them warm, but it changes things. Years ago, people kept bees underground. They kept them in constant cellars. In fact, Craig Stella of Penn State keeps his bees in one climate, indoors. So I believe we need to go to 3 days, but I would say that all hives and locations within the areas are not created equal. They're different.
Yeah, I'm sure, and so, I mean, that should be reflected in essentially in the error bars in these graphs. So if we were to standardize and say, everybody in New Jersey, keep your bees in the exact same way, that would shrink those error bars down into a very tight range, I would think. But yeah, I'm sure all that stuff is going on.
I'll add commentary to what Charlie said. We originally thought we were going to look at Canadian lines as the indicator plant. The indicator plant that we noticed is forsythia. It seems like when forsythia hits, that next week the targets take off. So we actually tried this year to make a concerted effort to try and track a bunch of beekeepers asking them when did the forsythia bloom in your area and did it correspond. And we'll probably also ask you at some point in the beginning when you see that forsythia bloom in your area. We talked about different indicators. That's one that we think is
Would that mean that when the city blooms, that's the beginning of the 16 days, or that's, what does that mean? What does the city have?
Yeah, what does that mean is the question he's asking. What does forsythia have to do? Let me just say one thing. There are various plants of forsythia. They're not all the same. That's the first thing. Let's recognize that. Now, what we've noticed is every year I watch the numbers come in, and I'll see 1Z, 2Z, 1Z, 2Z, 10. And I go driving around. I work in Princeton, and I see this. It seems like every year in the past 3 years, when I see that 10 week, the forsythia blooms in Princeton. So I mentioned this to Charlie, and Charlie started asking everybody he knows, take a picture of the forsythia and see if it hooks. It did. Now, we had a funny year this year. Everything seemed to bloom earlier. Everybody agree with that? Yeah. But you also look in your hives, and they're as populated as any time you've seen in New Jersey this year. So swarms are going to be crazy. It was 1 week lag this year. But we did see 2 weeks ago was when that 10 came. 2 weeks ago about was the, forsythia came a week earlier. So I think it's not that far off to watch the forsythia. And if you haven't started to think about your swarm stuff when that forsythia is going, you might be a little late. So just kind of keep that in mind.
So, and from my point of view, ideally, if we could get that data and integrate it into this data set, then we could publish a paper that shows that there's a link between, that forsythia is a good predictor of swarming.
I was just going to comment as a science person that you have to, it seems like if you really want to record this data, you have to look at the dependent and independent variables. Because while the swarm may happen, it's dependent on so much of what preceded it. For instance, what was the weight of your hive when it was the winter? What is the weight of your stores? What was the winter? What was the consumption of your stores? Did you want 2 bees? Did you want 3 bees? Did you want mediums? What were the weight of your bees coming into it? What were your remote accounts? What did you use as your treatments? All of these things are coming into play along with the independent weather that's happening at the same time. So if you really want to look at it scientifically, I think you do have to take into effect the weights of the hives, the bees, the health, and everything else to try to see, the weaker hive obviously is not going to swarm like a stronger hive.
Right.
So you've got to record all of that data to actually, in my mind, get an accurate prediction.
Right, and I think that's a good point. What you're talking about there is a much more fine-grained analysis, right, than what we're doing up here, which is very crude. There should be some link. All of those events, all that stuff that's happening in the hive is dependent. The bees should be, they are in some ways in control of that buildup. Limited by things like, are they diseased or things like that. And they should be timing it to correlate with what's going on outside, right? So that it may depend, all of those events may depend, for example, on when they first start bringing in pollen, from the environment, which would be dependent upon GDD. So yeah, I think, what we're doing here is taking a very crude measure and trying to see if it in any way predicts that swarming, the beginning of all those events. A much more fine, ideally, you'd have this big, giant multiple regression with hive weight and, everything built in there, right, as predictors of when you actually get a swarm. If we get that data, that'd be great. then you could really accurately predict. And this didn't happen to come up in the talk or in the questions so far, but we all know that swarms happen. You'll have one day where suddenly, boom, this is kind of relates to what Kevin was saying here, where if the weather's nice, if the weather is bad for a little while and then suddenly you have a nice day, then boom, you get swarms happening. It's almost like they're sitting there waiting for the nice weather and they'll go out. So that's another thing that I know would figure into that multiple regression and say, if you really want to predict it down to the day, the morning of when they're going to fly, you'd need that stuff too. Like what is the temperature, by 9 o'clock a.m. or something like that. So yeah, ideally that's where I would see this research going as it gets refined, is to get all those factors and get measurements of them and be able to do it. If we could do a controlled study where ideally we could actually manipulate those conditions and then see changes in when the swarms departed, obviously that would be the most powerful. And that's, I don't know of all that many studies that have done that. It's so hard to do, to get a large sample of colonies that people are willing to let swarm. That's another issue with that. You have to let them swarm to be able to see when they're going to swarm. I guess you always capture them, but anyway, that's a good question.
Yeah, so along with these statistics, are you inside the hive at the time? That's really the only thing that makes a difference to me is what am I seeing in my hive and how long I usually see drones being laid and capped, and I'm looking at 2 or 3 weeks after that, after I'm seeing swarms, this was back in a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. This I think this fits in with some of the other things that we're talking about here. Where ideally we could do a project where we'd have, maybe we could take a select group of New Jersey beekeepers that would be willing to participate in some focus study, and we could pick, the top 5 factors or whatever: hive weight, drone presence, some of those important factors that you think might predict swarm timing. And then we could look to see, we could do a similar kind of analysis where we measure all those things, and then you actually measure the date at which they swarm, if you're willing to let them swarm. And, and then we could look to see whether we could predict it based on those factors. I mean, I'm sure you could do that if we can just get the colonies and the measurements. I'm sure you're all completely right that all that stuff definitely affects swarm timing. This is a much cruder analysis than that.
Yeah, let me let Dave off the hook here. He got invited into this. Listen, the simple notion of this was just this. We wanted to know how big was the swarm. So when you report it, it's a really simple survey. He asks you just 5 questions. How big is the swarm? What was the date, location? How far from the ground was it? You've all seen this if you come to the meetings. Simply every year, simply every year, we just record when the numbers come through. I like the, I'll take the book.
Double fisted it.
I'm going to come up here in front of the camera so you can see it.
Nice.
Simply, if we just keep tracking when it starts. And that one graph that we had that shows the last week in April is when the numbers come up. If we could keep that pattern going and do this over 10 years, I think it becomes obvious, no matter what the conditions are, beside the hives and the weather and all that other stuff, that if the numbers bear out that, then the last week in April is when swarming occurs in New Jersey. It's a general rule of thumb, right? We'll never get perfect with it. And I think this could be from...
Yes, we will.
From Tom Seeley had a graph from the 70s where he did this similar experiment in Arnott Forest. When did he see swarms? And he tracked it for a number of years. And he had a similar graph, that's where I stole the earlier borrowed the idea of just tracking the aggregate scoring over a period of time. I think the interesting thing is the first 3 years were kind of an experiment to get you guys out there getting awareness and getting you used to reporting. In the next couple of years, now that you all know about it in New Jersey, and please go back and tell your friends and family, if we can get some bigger numbers of data, then we can maybe dismiss some of this early data as getting to know each other and use that data to actually find out better information. So. That being said, Dave, any last comments I wanted to ask you and say thank you for coming out. I think this has been very interesting and really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the data, everybody.
Say thank you to Charlie. The passion of Charlie following
Yes.
over the years. Degree days and things like that.
Without a doubt, when swarming season starts, he calls me like 3 times a week. He loves those.
Oops, getting feedback.
Charlie